Okay, and okay, give me a countdown. Hi, and welcome again to a Explain Apologetics live stream. We usually live stream at night, but today we're live streaming from beautiful Bandaratama in Patalinjaya. It's actually my house, Chiang Mai, and just so you know, I did not get beat up. I actually hit a door today. So if anyone has any of those questions to ask, I'm here again with Pastor Nesan.
Good to be back.
Good, great to be back. How are you doing?
Well, I must admit I'm extraordinarily tired today, and part of the reason for that is we're doing a camp right now in Malacca. So I was speaking late night yesterday night in Malacca, and then this morning we just had a session in DUMC, Damansara Uttama Methodist Church, and we're doing this live stream right after that. And after this, we head back to Malacca, which for those of you who are watching this from outside Malaysia is about a good 200 kilometers, but 150 kilometers south of the Malaysian capital in Kuala Lumpur. So, the plan is to be back tonight as well because I'm speaking tomorrow in Doulos Presbyterian Church here. So, hectic traveling.
It's been a long day for you.
Yes.
A long night, not much sleep. So
It's fair to say that.
I was with you. I saw your speech today at DUMC. Excellent job, by the way.
Thank you.
So we are talking today about positive apologetics, and for our new watchers, I think we should explain what is apologetics first off.
Well, apologetics is a defense of the Christian faith, and it basically gains its understanding. Our understanding of apologetics really is very much derived from 1 Peter 3:15, which says that in our hearts we ought to revere Christ as Lord and always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks us to give reason for the hope that is within us, but that we should do so with gentleness and respect. So in many ways, the apologetic process very much is one that seeks to present a reasonable faith for defense for Christianity, but one that also is done with gentleness and respect.
So now we're talking about positive apologetics, and that doesn't just mean that it's happy apologetics.
Yeah.
I think that we should also begin by explaining the difference between positive and negative apologetics. What the two of those are.
So, as I mentioned earlier, apologetics is to give a defense of the Christian faith. And sometimes I think it's fair to say that apologetics itself can be very negative in the sense that we construe to defend the faith is to tear down another faith. And I think that can be very, very dangerous.
Right.
So what we try to do sometimes is when a person presents an idea to us, say the idea that if there is a God, what proof do you have that there is a God, for example? Or that, you see, the fact that I can't see God is evidence that there is no God.
Right.
And one of the things that we tend to do is to very quickly switch into this negative apologetic mode, where we want to try to show the absurdity of the statement itself. And we would say things like, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Right.
And that sounds very well, and that really works in a Q&A setting, and you get lots of applause for quick, witty responses like that. But we have to ask ourselves, is that what the author of 1 Peter, the Apostle Peter, commending us and asking us to do when he tells us we ought to give reasonable defense for the faith, for the hope that is within us? It seems that what he's telling us to do is to present reason. And that really goes into what we call positive apologetics. So the difference is essentially this. Negative apologetics seeks to demonstrate why that view or that position is wrong, whereas positive apologetics seeks to establish why we are right. So just to illustrate back on the question that I initially threw out. If there is a God, we should be able to see the fact that there is no God. We can't see a God is evidence that there is no God. Now, if that is the assertion or the question brought forward, instead of doing that, we ought to give reasons for why God exists instead of pointing out the absurdity of that. But I think essentially, this would be the main difference between positive apologetics and negative apologetics.
Now, why obviously, both of them can be used to prove the existence of God or to prove an argument. Why is each of them important? Why is negative apologetics important? Why is positive apologetics important?
I think, in a sense, as the old saying goes, there's a difference between knowing and showing your faith. When I came to faith, and in my interview with Tom Jump, the American atheist, I pointed out that the reason ultimately I'm a Christian, the main reason is because I was born into a Christian family. And so, but that doesn't mean that is the reason why anyone should be a Christian at all. We have good reasons and bad reasons.
Yes.
But when you deal with positive apologetics, what you're trying to do is to sort of present or really to bear the burden of proof as a means of demonstrating intellectual integrity, in that we genuinely care about the questions we receive. So we want to demonstrate that, and I think that, sorry, my apologies, it's very useful to communicating with someone who is not a Christian or who has questions about Christianity, reasons for why Christianity is true. So that when you ask me reasons, I am not trying to present a robust answer as to why your question itself is fallacious or betrays some sort of a misunderstanding. Rather, I'm trying my best to show you, to give you answers to your question itself. But once someone is a Christian, and they already believe this, I think negative apologetics can be very useful into explaining to them why a certain position is not tenable or not right. And why, for example, if someone is a Christian, I would demonstrate why this objection doesn't work, because they already believe it. So I just think both of them has its place. But my biggest concern, Christian, is that people tend to use negative apologetics a lot in dealing with people who are not Christians. We always try to go and show people that your disposition is wrong, it doesn't make sense. I don't think that's very helpful or biblical.
I think we all want to be, in many ways, like Christopher Hitchens. We all sort of want to be the theistic Christopher Hitchens. We all want the sort of the bon mot, the quip that makes everyone laugh. But that doesn't necessarily bring people to God, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. I think the goal of all Christian apologetics should be to genuinely proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news of what Jesus has done. And if it doesn't do that, if the goal of apologetics is to just tear down people and their views, then I don't think the spirit in which we're doing it is right.
Right. Because I know, for instance, I'm taking an apologetics class from you, and you asked us recently if you had 1 minute to explain to somebody if they said, why, for instance, a question like, why would God permit evil? And sort of, my first answer is, give the facts as to why their argument is fallacious, and then say at the end of that 1 minute, well, let me introduce you to Jesus Christ. What you were saying is that's the wrong way to do it, because the first and foremost thing needs to be the gospel, that we need to focus on the gospel first when dealing with unbelievers.
Yeah, I think the whole goal of Christian apologetics is not an end to itself. Apologetics doesn't exist as an end to itself. It is a methodology of presenting the gospel of Jesus Christ in a defensive and reasonable manner. I think when you lose sight of that, then the focus comes into how do you win the argument, in which case I would say negative apologetics does really well in a debate. Right? Because you want to demonstrate why the other person's position doesn't quite work. But you've always got to ask yourself, am I in a debate? Because if genuinely I'm a believer in what Jesus has done for me, then I want to communicate this and genuinely help the other person see why this is true. So it's not very helpful, to say the least, in say some of these circumstances. And to take your example, the problem of evil, where someone says that, why does God permit evil? And you begin to demonstrate, for example, the understanding, well, if God doesn't exist, then evil cannot possibly exist, because what is the moral basis on which you would decide whether something is good or evil? So that, in the words of Ravi Zacharias, that if you don't have a moral lawgiver, God, you don't have the moral law. And if you don't have the moral law, you don't have good. And if you don't have good, you don't have evil. So what really is your question? But that is a very good way of pointing out that the very assertion or the argument or the question, why does God permit evil, in and of itself very much assumes the existence of God. But if I were to be presented with that, I'm not going to try, if the person is not a Christian, to demonstrate why is it that that the argument or the question assumes that. Rather, what I want to try and do is to show that how in the death and resurrection of Jesus, how God deals with evil in that sense. So I think that would be my focus, to show that how the greatest evil that ever occurred in the face of the earth was the death of our Lord Jesus Christ, and how death to the Christian is also the greatest good that has ever happened in the earth, because God offers forgiveness to everyone who believes in Jesus on the basis of Jesus' saving work. So both that would be my focus, rather than to just deal with the absurdity of the Christian.
So, just in case you're just joining us, you are listening to the Explain Apologetics live stream. This is third live stream.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
And so it's my name is Chris Golden. This is Pastor Samuel Nesan, brilliant apologist, Christian apologist.
We haven't paid you yet for that, right?
Yeah, look, it's 50 rand.
Okay. That's fair. Yeah.
I'm cheap. And banana leaf.
Banana leaf, okay.
Yeah. So we are talking about positive apologetics and why it is important, how it can win people for how it can convict people, for Christ. And obviously, you are a Calvinist.
Yes.
So yes.
Unapologetically so.
Unapologetically so. I am not. But so, in terms of positive apologetics, if you were to make an argument, why it is important for the Calvinists and why it is important for the Arminian, what would be your answer to those?
So you're asking, why is apologetics important for the Arminian and the Calvinist, contrasting
that, yes.
Well, I think to the Calvinists, in a sense that God has ordained everything, and the reason as a Calvinist I preach the gospel is because it is a command, not an option.
Yes.
And if I am a believer in Christ, that is my obligation to preach the gospel and to honor Christ in everything I do.
Yes.
So that is the reason as a Calvinist. But I think that question ought to be raised to an Arminian, why they do that. I mean, to have an Arminian answer that directly, I think would be a lot better. But I will just answer from the Calvinist position and say that many people tend to misunderstand the Calvinistic position, which is that if God has predestined all things, why bother to even evangelize? Why bother to do apologetics? And I think such a question demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding in distinguishing between the means and the ends through which God's decrees work. Just because God decrees the end, namely a person's salvation, does not deny or negate the fact that He also decrees the means through the end, which in this case is by preaching of the gospel. So that matters as well, because in that wider scheme. So that's why I do apologetics, and I never do apologetics to win souls. Now, I'm not insinuating in any way that that's why my Armenian friends do apologetics, but I would never do apologetics on trying to win souls. Ultimately,
job.
Absolutely, it's the work of God at the end of the day to convict people or otherwise. But my role as an apologist is to demonstrate reasons for believing that God exists, reasons for believing that Christianity is true, and to present the gospel in both those occasions.
Excellent answer. All right, so we are going to go to some of the questions from our users. And please ask questions, because we love to hear from you, and we especially the people who are in our chat. We welcome your questions, and keep them coming. So, first question: do you think a person's personality and occupational field would dictate their choice of apologetics methodology? Example, an empirical scientist would prefer evidential apologetics to classical apologetics. A neutral lover might prefer classical apologetics. I think it might be wise, firstly, to distinguish evidential apologetics versus classical apologetics, and versus existential apologetics too. So, in terms of that question, it's kind of a lot to unpack there.
Right. So evidential apologetics, in a nutshell, is a methodology of doing apologetics, which, in its fundamental core, assumes or rather asserts that evidence is required in order to justify a position. So that if you're going to justify Christianity, you must do so on the basis of the evidence, and hence the term evidentialism. Whereas you have presuppositional apologetics, which presupposes that everyone has a working worldview,
Yes.
and we ought not to presume that there is any neutral ground, but really work from our presupposition towards,
Yes.
and basically engage other presuppositions. And you have the classical apologetics position, which is one that I'm leaning closest to,
Yes.
which is basically called classical because that was the traditional form of apologetics that was practiced in the Middle Ages.
Yes.
And essentially what classical apologetics is a two-step apologetic process which begins with affirming the existence of God,
Right.
first and foremost, and then demonstrating why, that through the scriptures and the rest of it, why Christ is the revelation, the perfect revelation of God who exegetes him. I think the distinctive, really, with regards to why I am a classical apologist, is that I believe in natural revelation, that God has revealed himself in nature, and that nature, therefore, can be a neutral ground for me to present a meaningful case for Christianity or for the existence of God. So, if you take that away, what you have then is basically saying we don't have any neutral ground, and you just got to work on the basis of our presupposition in order to do that. I'm not very comfortable with that. But to answer that question, I think naturally in debates, the position of evidentialism tends to shine quite a little bit. Because people want to hear evidence for the position.
Yes.
I think among people who are naturally practicing science in the scientific enterprise, they would definitely prefer evidential apologetics because I'm interested in the evidence and not, for example, in your feelings. That's the famous saying, facts don't care about your feelings. Yeah. So, right. And what essentially classical apologists try to do is we try to maintain this common ground and to work from there. But I think that for me personally, it is more of my theological persuasion that determines my preference in terms of the apologetic methodologies. But I can readily see why, in response to that question, why is it someone, say, from the scientific industry would want to prefer evidentialism approach? But maybe if the question goes further on, I'll explain, why I think those are not very helpful. But
now I want to pitch you a softball, which is I'd like you to talk about your feelings about presuppositional apologetics, and expound upon it a little more, because I know I've heard you talk about it before, and it's fun to hear.
Right. Okay. So for some time now, I think I've considered myself a presuppositional apologist, but I began doing work on basically John Calvin's sensus divinitatis, which is Latin for sense of divinity, and I began to expound on that and realized that Calvin, is whom the Reformed tradition really looks up to, has a very high view of God's revelation in nature. Like he talks about, in the very first chapters of his famous Institutes of the Christian Religion, 5th edition. Calvin, in book 1, early chapters, begins expounding on, how God has revealed himself in nature. And in that sense, I think Calvin is very much a natural theologian. In that, that's not to say that he believes that You could tell Christianity is true from observing nature. That's obviously absurd. But then one could determine that God existed on the basis of God's revelation in nature, Romans 1. But your question was more towards presuppositionalism and why is it that I'm on this side. So I just explained it was the natural theology that really drove me to the classical side. And a lot of that is due to R.C. Sproul, who is a classical apologist. But
a favorite of mine too, I must say.
Oh yeah, indeed, yeah. It's my all-time favorite, the late R.C.
Yes.
But when it comes to presuppositional apologetics, for the most part, I think it's actually quite philosophically solid in the sense that it engages the problem of evidentialism.
Right.
Evidentialism makes this assumption and assertion that in order to prove anything or to be epistemologically justified in believing something, which is to say to know something rationally, one needs to have propositional evidence. We need to have evidence in order to know something, essentially. But the problem with that is that very statement in and of itself has no propositional evidence supporting it. It is very much a presupposition. And that's why I think the presuppositionalist would say that just simply saying that you need evidence itself is a demonstration that that principle does not work. And that there are certain foundational principles that hold true, among which, for example, are the reality of the external universe, the other mind such as my own, and also, one may add, the existence of God itself can be defined as a properly basic belief that one is rationally entitled to hold to, in the absence of any logical or evidential basis. So the presuppositionalist is basically saying, I am warranted within my right to believe that God exists.
Yes.
And the Christian worldview, therefore, is the most logically cohesive worldview. I'm going to presuppose that this is true. And once I realize this is true, I begin to engage the others outside. So in a sense, it would basically just bite the bullet for a lot of times. You accuse and say that, there's this problem with the Bible and this problem with the Bible. The presuppositionalists will just happily accept that. And basically say and work towards defending why that is so, as opposed to maybe what an evidentialist would do, which is to determine if that is so. Take, for example, a question that would be raised to a presuppositionalist would not be, if God is so good, why is there so much evil? The question raised to the presuppositionalist ought to be, since God is good, why is there so much evil? Because he begins with a presupposition that there is. And naturally, the defense of the presuppositionalist will work towards defining and defending why that is so. But the evidentialist, what he would do is tend to say that, let me give reasons for believing that God is good, in spite of the fact that we see this, and he works on the other way around, if you see what I mean. So he begins to justify why this has to be the case. But as a presuppositionalist just takes it as it is. So I think that is, in a sense, a very, very brief caricature of what presuppositionalism is. Of course, not the one that I made in my lecture, which you've heard before.
Again, that is brief compared to the lecture. And it was interesting, but probably not brief in terms of the in terms of a live stream, but very good. Just in case you're tuning in, Explain Apologetics live stream. We're talking about positive apologetics and to a certain extent negative apologetics, which is my next question. One of our user questions: when do you recommend using negative apologetics?
To a bunch of Christians, in a church, to show them why the other position doesn't work. Negative apologetics is very useful. Sometimes in a debate, I think negative apologetics can be very useful. But I think particularly I need to say this, that in a context like Malaysia, we work very hard to try and build interfaith understanding among the different faiths that exist in Malaysia. And Malaysia is not quite the United States of America, and we try very hard to build this interfaith understanding. And I'm personally involved in a lot of interfaith dialogues. A close friend of mine, Tuan Haji Kamaruddin Abdullah, shout out to him if he's by any chance watching this. And essentially he works very hard to try and build this. Like we were recently in a conversation saying we need to have more interfaith dialogues where you do that. And if you start bringing negative apologetics in, which is basically saying why this is wrong and why that is wrong and why we are right, I think there are two problems with it. Number one, it will destroy any possibility of a meaningful dialogue because first and foremost, just because you prove someone wrong doesn't make you right.
Yeah.
You could demonstrate that a certain cult is wrong, but just because you can demonstrate that is wrong doesn't make me right by default. I would still need to make positive apologetics why I am right. And so I'm much more content to have dialogues where we demonstrate why is it that I've come to this position and why is it I believe in this position. Right. And I would love to hear from you why you believe in that position.
Exactly.
Instead of commenting, things like reductio ad absurdum, where you reduce to absurdity. I don't think that's very helpful at all. Particularly, I just say that in the context of a multi-religious country like Malaysia. You need to. I think people have no issues with you demonstrating why your position, why you think your position is right. But once you start running people down, that's not going to be very helpful. It doesn't help anything.
I don't think it works in the United States either. I think you have a lot of people who use the reductio ad absurdum argument to sort of prove the existence of God or the existence of a deity without actually proving the Christian deity and actually making arguments for Christianity. And I think that a lot of people who do get sort of relegated to the sidelines because they're not interesting, they don't make, pithy comments, that sort of thing. So I would agree with you that I think it's mostly for when you're dealing with Christian audiences. Right. Now, in terms of apologetics methodology, how does the worldview of the unbeliever affect our choice of apologetics methodology? And I'll go with my own experience because I was a former Christian or a former atheist. Sorry.
I was hoping you're not a former Christian.
Well, I was a former Christian too. I was a Christian, then became an atheist, and so what I would say to you is, you know my story. I was led down by my faith leaders. I had a lot of my parents divorced, became unbelievers. Sort of a lot of hurt there, and I also found when I found newfound freedom as an adult. I found that the strictures of Christian faith, weren't necessarily something that I wanted to follow at that point. I was certainly into, I would go out, drinking with friends to excess. In the United States too, certain plants are legal that are not legal over here, that I might have partaken in. I will neither confirm nor deny. What would you tell me? What would be your argument? I drop all of that on you. How would what would be your methodology in terms of approaching me in a positive apologetics? What would you say?
See, first of all, I realized that I wouldn't be dealing with any of the vices that you may or may not have been involved in. You would neither confirm nor deny. But what I'll be dealing with more is the issue of the heart. And I think that really is what is the issue. And that is, why do people do things that they do? I think essentially it boils down to the fact that we are all sinners. And that really is the vacuum in which I think Christ gives us the answer, in that Christ comes to give us, reconcile us to the Father. And I think sometimes a lot of the sins that we commit are not really the problem. And I think this is so important to emphasize. Because people try to treat the symptoms as if they were the problems itself. And these are not. These are symptoms of a bigger problem, which is the reason a person is doing this, giving up drinking with friends and all that. Don't deal with the drinking. Don't deal with the vices. Deal with the problem. This person needs Jesus Christ. And so my response would be, why you need Jesus Christ, particularly to that, and more importantly, the reason why you find the appeal there is because You don't find your peace in your own heart. I mean, you don't find that relationship with God in your own heart. And that is what I would offer you in Jesus Christ. The last thing I want to do is to go ahead and run down and say why drinking is wrong. Here's a list of 10 things that could happen to you and show you a diagram of a human anatomy and showing you what the liquor does to your livers and your livers become a poor liver. I mean, I'm talking about the football club, but you get what I mean. That's not what I want to do. In that sense, what I'd rather do is tell you why is it that Jesus is the answer to that particular issue. But before I can do that, see, this way apologetics really takes a much longer period in a one-to-one basis, and that's, by the way, where real apologetics is done.
Yeah.
I would have to find out what your real questions are. And notice you mentioned that at the start about your parents, about the disappointment that he had, about certain things that he had. I want to deal with those issues because that really is the issues. Everything else that happens is symptomatic. But I want to deal with the problem itself and demonstrate why Christ, in his atoning work, provides healing for us. I'm not talking about physical healing, but I'm talking about that emotional healing, particularly the healing of the relationship between you and God. So that's where I'll be focusing my positive apologetics on. And you can clearly see, I hope the viewers in the house can clearly see, why is it a negative apologetics to something like this? Really is. It's a no-brainer.
Yeah. Like I don't think that you could address, my issues at that point by, sort of breaking down, why what I was thinking was bad, because I could probably have told you that if I thought about it long enough. That's not going to lead me to Christ. So it's something where it's just adaptability is what you're saying. It's is there any particular do you compartmentalize certain methodologies? Like I'm going to use this methodology when dealing with this, kind of, and or I have a different methodology for somebody who's suffering heartbreak, that sort of thing.
Oh yes, but I don't think that typical apologetic methodology really comes into play then. Say for example, to a mother who has just lost a child through a miscarriage or something like that, the last thing you want to do is to demonstrate the logical deficiencies of thinking that, for example, God is evil in causing such things, and to present a greater good argument why God, can do greater good through the evil that has happened in your life. I mean, as much as I believe those things to be true, what we've sometimes got to do is what the scripture tells us to do, to mourn with those who mourn, to grieve with those who grieve. So that really takes a little bit of apologetics too. So I remember speaking on a one-to-one basis in a camp that I spoke in with a gentleman who had lost his father. And I won't go into the details as to how he lost his father, but the circumstances were quite tragic. And honestly, there was no need to demonstrate directly why is it that these things were happening. So much so that the question was not what is the answer. The question is who will answer. Who will journey with me? Who will allow me to defend? And most of the time in that, when I was in that camp, I just spent listening to this person. And being with this person, and this person cried. And eventually sharing the gospel when the opportunity came. I mean, this person was a Christian. Now, don't get the idea that the gospel is only for those who are not Christians. The gospel is very much for the believers too. And it was so interesting to see how the gospel transformed this person. But that is not a quick fix solution. That takes months, if not years, of working with a person. And that's where sometimes you need pastors as well who need to be apologetically inclined.
And another question we got, you would say then that there is a role for emotions and feelings in positive apologetics. It's not just something that is intellectual arguments.
Oh, absolutely. I think there was a wise saying once, I think it was my dad who told me this, that what comes from the head often goes to the head, but what comes from the heart goes to the heart. But that is not to intellectually dichotomize between the head and the heart, because I know that itself leads to a huge philosophical debate, which I'm not going to get into. But there is a really important truth to that, and that is that sometimes we cannot be very cognitive in our responses in apologetics. And I particularly noticed that, sometimes Jesus takes into account that people are emotionally weak. The shortest verse in the Bible is that Jesus wept. why on earth would Jesus weep? I think that's sometimes what it is. So to answer that question, you just can't go full blown logical reasons all the time. You've got to distinguish the two and to realize sometimes what is the question that is being asked. And this is what I've always found, that the intellectual questions very often are a mask to the emotional questions.
Yeah.
And if you just deal with the intellectual questions, that's not going to work, because that's not the real question. There is always a question behind the question. And the goal of apologetics is not to deal with the mask, it's to deal with the heart.
Yeah.
In the sense that to deal with the real question. A person may be saying, well, if God is so good, why is there so much evil in the world? What that person is really saying, what that question is a mask for, is if God was so good, why did he take my grandfather away?
Yeah.
And you've got to deal with that.
Yeah. Well, why did evil happen to me? Why did this, evil? So we're going to get into something similar, but a little bit more complex here, which is, can we say that fideism is just laziness on a Christian to not learn how to defend the faith and give a reason for the hope they have? And how do we avoid extremes, apologetics, in fideism versus rationalism? Now, I think we ought to define our terms here, because some watchers, listeners might not necessarily be familiar with these terms. So let's define what we're talking about here.
So fideism is the view that there is a logical incompatibility between faith and reason.
Yes.
That faith and reason don't quite go together, and that you don't use reason to defend Christianity. You just deal with faith, and that's where the Latin word fide, whereas the reformers love to say sola fide, faith alone. Fideism is basically not so much sola fide, but it's an emphasis on that we need faith and not reason.
Yes.
Now, I would think that that would kind of be a misunderstanding based on 1 Peter 3:15, because 1 Peter tells us to give reason for the hope. And in a biblical sense, this is really interesting. Most people may not know this. That in English, faith and hope mean a bit of a different thing. But in the biblical sense, faith and hope is really the difference between present tense and future tense.
Okay. Yes.
So that faith is something in the present tense and hope is something in the future tense.
Right.
But it's really faith of the future tense is hope. And so we are told to give reason for the hope that is within us, in the sense that Christ is a future hope as well as the present.
Right.
But we're told to do that. And I think that fideism, the question is that intellectual laziness? I don't know. It could be. It could be. I think it would be very harsh to accuse every fideist of being intellectually lazy, particularly since one of the guys who came up with fideism is Soren Kierkegaard, right?
Yeah.
Kierkegaard is, he's anything but lazy. He's a complex guy to read, but I don't think he's a lazy fellow, to put that word simply. Another one person who may be associated with this kind of fideistic thinking is Blaise Pascal. I don't think it's fair to label Blaise Pascal as being lazy, although I must say to you, Christian, I don't really like Pascal's wager.
But that's one thing that everyone knows about Pascal's wager, and everyone kind of reduces his theology to that, and which is, I think, it is a gross misrepresentation of what he has to say. I will also say that I have read Kierkegaard, and I am not lazy. It is not a lazy experience.
Yes.
But so you would say not necessarily that it is not necessarily a lazy explanation, but would you say that it can be for people who don't want to marry faith and reason, would just sola fide and call it a day?
That actually rhymes.
There you go.
That depends solely on whether you can distinguish between what I would call intellectual fideism,
right,
and just common fideism. Common fideism, I'm just using these terms really loosely here, and simply mean that it's just people who don't want to think. You have people that they are not classical fideism in the way that Kierkegaard was. They won't give you the reasons and the rational that he presented for his, which is quite ironic, isn't it? That Kierkegaard presents reasons for his fideism, but they're not going to do that, right? So, but on the other hand, intellectual fideism is not in any way lazy. There are some truths to that that I think need to be further explored, and I wouldn't throw everything away. One of the things with all these methodologies is that it's fair to say that they all contain truth, and I'm not a pluralist in any sense of that word. Okay, so I don't believe that a little bit truth here, a little bit truth there, but we're talking about a methodology here as to what works, and I think there's usefulness in all of these methodologies in some ways. So dealing with fideism, I think they tend to place a very high emphasis on divine revelation and the need to have faith, which I think is important. Let's not dismiss that. I don't think that's lazy, but it can be, and I think that's where your question is very well phrased. It can boil down to an intellectual laziness where people just come and say, I'm not going to think about these issues. They just blindly accept them on the basis of faith and don't ask all these deep questions. And I've faced people who say that. And that is lazy.
We face people who say that all the time when we have questions. And I mean, I've dealt with that kind of thinking, and it really does turn you off. It is not. It's not an argument. It's not. It's have faith because God exists, which actually turns people off to it. I mean, I think I told you that one of the reasons I turned away from the faith was I had asked a priest who I was having doubts about Christianity, and his advice to me was fake it until you make it, which is probably the most cynical version of fideism that I have ever heard. But there you go.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you were saying.
So another. By the way, just another reminder: you are watching the Explain Apologetics live stream. We are talking about positive apologetics, and we are going to talk about now tough questions from friends, tough questions that you might face, and how positive apologetics factors into it. So the question is, many Christians are afraid to answer tough questions from their friends because they are afraid the answer might turn their friends away from Jesus. For instance, why does the Christian faith teach that homosexuality is a sin? Which is worse, bad apologetics or no apologetics?
Bad apologetics, I guess, would be, I think on my list, worse, because sometimes if you're silent, at least someone else could give an answer. But sometimes when you give bad apologetics, what you have to do is you have to unwind and undo all the mistakes first, because it's like you build a really flimsy structure. You've got to first demolish it, clear it out. And then in that place of it, build something new. So definitely no apologetics is better than bad apologetics. But I do realize, that philosophically speaking, you can't compare something to nothing. So I'll leave that as it is without justifying it too much. But I think your main question is tough questions, whether if it turns people away from Christianity, what do you do about that? Good. I think this is a big problem with Christianity, that we make the gospel message so much so that it's so hard to say no to it. But think about some of the nonsense that is done in our churches, and I will say this: it's nonsense. We ask people, how many people want to go to heaven? And you have a room full of people that put their hands up and say, I want to go there. And then you tell them, repeat this prayer after me. Dear Jesus, come into my heart, I thank you. And you basically ask yourself,
every Sunday.
Every
single Sunday.
And the thing about this is this: if you do things like that, all of a sudden you start asking yourself why these sheep will not become goat and why discipleship is not working.
Right.
Why is it that we did the evangelism right, but the discipleship, these guys are, they don't want to come to church. We've got to make church so exciting for them, because otherwise they want to have nothing to do with Christian fellowship. They don't want to read their Bible. We've got to put videos now for them to do, because, and the truth is, these are not Christians. They never said yes to Christ. They said yes to go to heaven. They just don't want Christ to be there when he's there. So So we've got to get rid of that sort of thing in doing apologetics, and we've got to realize, give people a chance to reject the gospel.
Yeah.
You see, the gospel is not a suggestion. The gospel really, as far as I'm concerned, I would go to the extent almost to say, the gospel is not even an invitation. The gospel is primarily a command. Primarily, it is a command. And when you get a command from Christ, believe, and the apostles presented the command, believe, repent, and be baptized. When you get a command, you really have one of two options. You either have to submit to it, to surrender to it, or to reject it.
Yeah.
I feel people deserve a chance to reject it.
Yes.
And if you ask yourself, what if they turn away from it? That's good.
Yeah.
Noah had only 8 people in the ark, and all 8 of them were saved. It would be a terrible thing if he had like 200,000 people in the ark and all. No one was saved.
Yeah.
So yes, it's okay to maintain a high standard, and it's okay when people rejected Christianity. If people reject Christianity.
And most of these Christians know the answer apologetically in terms of these questions. I mean, they may have different ways of phrasing it, but they're too afraid to turn away unbelievers in terms of the faith. And even if you were to, let's say, get this person into the faith, I mean, getting them to say the sinner's prayer is kind of the biggest, oh, and we have a dog. This is Rosie, who somehow escaped. Yes. Rosie is a Calvinist, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yes, yes. Which is considering
Rosie had no free will in that decision.
Yes.
But
it's actually bad for her, considering I don't think she's among the elect when you consider how often she poops on the bed. But most of these Christians are afraid to turn away unbelievers, and you would say that bad apologetics is not making believe. I mean, the sinner's prayer is obviously sort of like the extreme end of it, which is sort of just getting people to say a prayer and then not really making them Christians.
Right.
But in terms of bad apologetics, to just so that you don't turn away unbelievers, you would say that that's a bad thing.
Yes, I mean, I think, again, so what I was, just to reiterate what I said just now, we ought to give people a chance to reject the gospel.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the gospel is a command.
Yes.
And I think maybe an illustration like this may help. If the gospel was merely an invitation, then what you want to do is to stretch the door of the place so wide so that anyone who remotely comes within a 50-meter radius of the door will be considered in that door, and you want to do that to kind of like have everyone in. But it's not. The command of the gospel is really believe Jesus and repent. It's like saying come in. And if they don't come in, then they're not obeying the command. And that's what it is. So there is this big fear of turning people away, but historically, Christians have grown in the context where people have been presented the true gospel in which people are allowed to turn away.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think there's this big fear. We don't want to turn people away. The biggest person who turned the most people away was Jesus himself. Look at John chapter 6. It begins with Jesus with about 5,000 people, I believe. And at the end of John chapter 6, same chapter. Chapter beginning, 5,000 people. Chapter end, there's only about 12 left. And Jesus looks to them. And talk about turning people away. Jesus is the master of it. He turns to the 12 and he says, aren't you going to? and Peter looks at it and says, Lord, to where will we go? You have the words that bring eternal life. To which Jesus says, I chose the 12 of you, didn't I? Yet one of you is a devil. Even then, Jesus had to make that disclaimer there. So turning people away does not necessarily imply that you're dishonoring Christ. And very often you ought to maintain that high standard.
A lot of this too has to do with modern thinking.
Yes.
We have modern thinking about LGBT issues. We have modern thinking about cohabitation, about sex, about a lot of different things in the Bible. How has modern thinking changed our approach to apologetics? Or has
in a sense, I think what has happened with church culture is we've made church so easy to access.
Right.
I think was it Aquinas who was once asked, how would you know if someone is really Christian or not? I can't remember, it was Aquinas, and the answer was, well, they'll start getting up early on Sunday and coming to church. That's how you know that they were Christian. But today, church has become something like a fun club. You have activities and all that. That's, again, don't get me wrong, that's not something that is inherently bad. But it becomes bad when you don't know the line between what it means to be a Christian, what it means to go to church to honor God, to give God reverence that is due to God alone, and to basically go there to be entertained. And a lot of people go and say, well, I find this church boring, the worship was boring, I didn't quite feel the oomph behind the beat. And you've got to ask yourself, what did he go there for? Did he go there to get some beats, and feel the high? I don't know. But if you went there for worship, you ought to go there for worship. I'm just saying that's what it ought to be. But you have this consumerism mentality that is within our churches today. And that, I think, has plagued the church a lot. In that we're trying to cater everything to the consumer, so much so, we do so at the expense of feeding the sheep.
Okay, but let's say that gets people in and gets them to hear the word. Like, let's say, I find it to be a little bit vulgar. That, for instance, you can get a latte, outside church. In the lobby, they have, people, a barista serving drinks. You can go in with a latte, whatever. But if that helps people to hear the word, is that necessarily a bad thing?
No.
Okay.
It's not. But you see, that I have no problems with people serving lattes or anything like that. I have a problem when you start trying to modify your worship to such a way in order for you to appeal to a generation that does not want to worship.
Right.
That becomes an issue. Then you start to cater your sermons in such a way to appeal to a generation that just wants to have nothing to do with the Word of God.
Right.
And what we end up having is a lot of people coming there for the activities.
Experience.
But it comes at the expense of the sheep being fed, because there are people that genuinely want to be fed. They are coming there to be fed. They're coming there to be worshipped. And it comes at the expense of them. And that is not right. So I think that's really my issue with that.
So we're getting short on time. But a few more questions. And speaking of evil, how do the different schools of apologetics address the problem of evil?
So I think the presuppositional camp, I know. Very, very interesting way. And I'll be honest with you, I love the way the presuppositional camp deals with the problem of evil. And that is to basically say, the answer can usually be summarized by this phrase: on what basis?
Right.
By what standard? And this is typically the presuppositional answer. So you say that, well, isn't God evil for doing that? Evil for doing what? Okay, evil for, say, the destruction and the annihilation of the Canaanites. Okay. By what standard is God evil? That's the presuppositional. Remember, he already presupposes it to be true. He just wants to show that your worldview doesn't make sense. And he's going to say, by what standard is God unfair? And then you try to do that and you say, well, the presuppositionalist has no problem saying that God did it to glorify himself in that manner.
Right.
And to be fair, I actually think that is a very biblical way of answering the question. The problem is sometimes, could there be a better answer? Could there be a more historically persuasive answer?
Right.
Is the question. And while I'm a big supporter of the way that the presuppositional camp handles that, maybe someone along the classical camp would deal more with, for example, an emphasis on Jesus and to show how Jesus, redeems the so-called evils in the Old Testament. Which again, I don't think it's exclusive to the classical side. That I think can be shared with the presuppositional side as well, because it's still it's kind of shared. But here's where I think the evidentialist approach may be slightly different. In that, while the fideistic approach would be to say, just have faith, right? Just make sure you have faith, and you've got to trust what God can do. By the way, that's not a wrong thing, right? It's just something that I don't think is very helpful as an apologetic methodology. But when you get to the evidentialist side, what the evidentialist tends to do would be to say something along these lines, that You've got to first demonstrate why God's existence and God's existence, I mean, that means the existence of a all-powerful and omnibenevolent, all-loving God is somehow incompatible with there being evil.
Right.
So you've got to demonstrate why this incompatibility exists between God and evil. And until and unless you can demonstrate this incompatibility, the theist, the Christian, is well within his rights to say God could have good reasons for permitting evil in this world.
Right.
And as long as there is a logical possibility that God could have good reasons for permitting evil in the world, the atheistic assertion that evil and God are somehow logically incompatible really falls flat on its face, because the theist can just show possibility as long as that's possible. I don't even need to justify that. But you can see how different that approach is from, say, the presuppositional approach and what could be the classical approach and the fideistic approach. You have to approach it very differently. And honestly, I've used all four. It really depends who I'm dealing with. So while I tend to lean towards, as I said in the start, the more classical method, if you're dealing with someone who is suffering, the last thing you want to do is to present the evidential basis.
Yeah, that's.
If you're dealing with a family member who is terminally ill,
you can't. It's not going to win them over to Christ, or it'll turn them away.
Certainly, I mean, going to them and saying, you've got to first demonstrate the incompatibility of there being a good God and there being a really strong evil present, and until and unless you can do that, I'm within my right to say God is good. That's not apologetics.
Exactly.
Right. But it works well in the debate, I have to say.
Yeah. So, okay. I think that we are out of time. And so I was wondering if there's anything you would like to end with as sort of a final defense.
Final defense.
Positive apologetics.
Yeah. One of the best things that you can do, I think, in positive apologetics, when you present a meaningful and purposive defense or deliberate defense for Jesus and the gospel, is that you always must realize, I think, in a sense that I think this analogy is very useful, in that in order to demonstrate that 2 + 2 is 4, you don't have to demonstrate that 2 + 2 is not 5. You don't have to demonstrate that 2 + 2 is not 6, that 2 + 2 is not 7, that 2 + 2 is not 8. All you have to do is to demonstrate that 2 + 2 is 4. And once people understand that, they will automatically realize that it's not 5, 6, 7, 8, and whatever number you want to add behind it. That's really the difference between positive apologetics and, say, negative apologetics. And I'll just end with a story about in the 1970s how Christians used to refer to a particular cult and say that you're a cult, you're wrong, this is bad. And they had a big fallout, let's say, in the 1970s, because they predicted that Jesus would come back in that year, and he didn't. Right? We're still here. And when Jesus didn't come back, there was a big fallout from that group. About 4 to 5 million people left that cult.
Yes.
But less than 10% became Christians. Less than 10% became Christians. And the reason for that is because Christians were saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And we never bothered to say why we were right, why Christianity is true, why the gospel is true. So people left that and went to atheism or something else. So what would a Christian do then? Should a Christian then go and demonstrate why atheism is wrong too? It's about time that we use positive apologetics. And let me just say this in closing, that positive apologetics in and of itself has to always be gospel-centered in it, that it tries to demonstrate why the gospel is really the answer, God's answer to any question that comes. Or how does this question relate to the gospel? That really should be our focus. I think if we do that, that becomes apologetics to the glory of God, as John Frame has said it. I'm done.
Okay. Well, we thank you for tuning in. We hope that you will tune into our future live streams. We're going to have one in 2 weeks.
So the frequency is 2 weeks. 2
weeks. And so our next one will hopefully be before Christmas, but as we approach the Christmas season, we obviously hope that our Christian viewers learned something today, that also non-believers, we hope that positive apologetics won you over. Since Christmas is coming, and we are eagerly inviting our friends to churches and parties, let's also be prepared to equip ourselves to answer questions about positive apologetics. That's the one thing that we should be able to take away from today's live stream. If you take away anything, what we want you to take away is you need to equip yourself. This is going to be a season where a lot of people are going to be coming to churches. You're going to see a lot of people who are, we talk about the Easter and Christmas, Easter and Christmas Christians. Right. And they're not really Christians, but they do it because of
the food's good.
The food's good, and it's something that they've done their entire life. It's tradition, and it is an opportunity for us to use positive apologetics to convict their hearts, to sort of, if you're an Armenian, to win their soul, to free will. If you're a Calvinist, to convict their hearts. The point is, let's equip ourselves with the knowledge of who Christ is, of what he says in the Bible, and all of that. Make sure that we know that, and make sure that we reach out to our friends and our relatives. And on that,
and just before that, if anyone has any further questions, we really would like to invite you to write to us. You can definitely write to us on our website, www.explainapologetics.com, or you can always private message us on Facebook, which is Explain Apologetics /Facebook. We certainly hope to hear your questions and to interact with you. And if you want to talk about any questions that you have, one of the things we want to do is avail ourselves to you to answer your questions. Yes. So please do not hesitate to write to us. Pass the time back to you.
Yes. So thank you all for watching. God bless you all. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
Take care. Have a blessed weekend. Take care.
Take care, everyone.